Soft piano music drifts in, like a memory that refuses to fade. Ethan Callahan stands by the window of his penthouse, the city spread beneath him like a map of every victory he's ever won and every emptiness he's ever felt. At 37, he has everything most men would trade their souls for: the power to build empires, the charm to make any woman fall, and the money to never hear the word no. Yet, tonight, surrounded by silence and glass, he realizes he can buy almost anything except peace. Outside, the wind hums against the tall windows. Inside, his reflection stares back, sharp suit, tired eyes. The man who once conquered boardrooms now feels conquered by his own success. People call him the man who seduced every woman, but what they never see is how cold it feels to be adored for the mask and never for the man underneath. And then fate decides to interrupt. A woman walks into his world, calm, steady, and utterly unimpressed by the glitter that blinds everyone else. Her name is Madeline Hart, and she's about to challenge everything Ethan thought he knew about power, about pride, and about love. This is where his story begins. A story not about how a man wins the world, but how he learns to find himself again. The morning light crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Callahan Tower, washing the marble office in a pale gold glow. The city below was already awake. Car horns, footsteps, a distant siren, a symphony of motion that never touched the silence inside. Ethan Callahan stood alone by the window, a mug of untouched coffee cooling in his hand. From here, 50 stories up, everything looked small: the streets, the people, even the problems that used to keep him awake at night. He used to like that feeling, being above it all. Lately, it only reminded him how far he'd climbed, and how alone the view felt from the top. His phone buzzed on the desk. Another meeting, another negotiation, another chance to prove that Callahan Enterprises was still the name whispered with admiration in every luxury circle across Europe and North America. He sighed, set the mug down, and straightened his tie, a small act of discipline in a life built entirely on control. The elevator chimed. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan," said Julia, his assistant, stepping inside with a tablet in hand. "Your 9 o'clock is confirmed with Zurich investors, and the PR team wants approval for the new ad campaign." Ethan nodded, eyes still on the skyline. "Remind them the Callahan name doesn't sell pleasure. It sells perfection." Julia hesitated, then added quietly, "And the HR board will need your final word on the new hire for strategic development." He barely looked up. Who did they pick? A woman? Madeline Hart. Stanford graduate, international strategist. She starts Monday. Fine. The answer came out flat, almost dismissive. When the door closed, Ethan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. Another name, another face, another person who'd try to impress him or fear him, usually both. He used to enjoy that power. Now, it just exhausted him. On the wall behind his desk hung a photograph, a young man standing in front of a half-built hotel on the French Riviera, sleeves rolled up, eyes full of hunger. That was him at 25, before the suits, before the endless flights and hollow handshakes, before every victory began to taste the same. A knock at the door pulled him back. "Mr. Callahan," Julia's voice again. "Your mother called. She wanted to remind you. It's your father's birthday today." The air stilled for a moment. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Tell her I'll send flowers." "Yes, sir." When she left, he sat there, motionless, staring at the photo again. His father had died a decade ago, a man of fierce ambition who built this empire from scratch. Ethan had inherited not just the business, but the loneliness that came with it. The empire had grown larger. The silence had too. He reached for the phone, then stopped halfway. What would he even say to his mother? "I'm fine," the same lie he told the world every day. A soft chime echoed from the computer screen, a reminder of the upcoming investor call. He pressed a button, his reflection appearing faintly against the camera feed. Perfect posture, perfect lighting, perfect mask. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," he began smoothly. The words flowed, practiced and flawless. Contracts, returns, growth. The kind of conversation that built fortunes and drained souls. But halfway through, his attention drifted to the muted skyline beyond the window. The city kept moving, unaware of the man who had everything and still felt nothing. When the call ended, he loosened his tie and walked toward the small bar in the corner. Poured himself a glass of water, not whiskey. He'd stopped drinking a year ago. Even his vices had started to feel like habits. From this height, he could almost see the ocean in the distance, a thin silver line against the morning haze. He thought of the resorts his company owned along that coast marble floors, champagne pools, couples posing for photos under sunset light, people chasing moments that would fade the second they returned home. He sold dreams he no longer believed in. The intercom blinked. Julia's voice again. "Sir, the press wants a quote about your upcoming partnership with the Geneva Group." Ethan exhaled softly. "Tell them success isn't built on luck. It's built on isolation and obsession." Julia paused. "Are you sure that's the message you want printed?" "Let them print the truth for once." He ended the call. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the only sound in the vast office. Ethan sat down, staring at the city again, tracing the edges of skyscrapers with his eyes. Somewhere out there, millions of people were living small, imperfect lives. Maybe that was what he envied most: imperfection. The kind that allowed laughter without calculation. He thought of the last woman he'd dated, a model from Milan. Beautiful, intelligent, fluent in the art of flattery. She had stayed 3 weeks before realizing she was in love with the idea of him, not the man himself. They always were. The elevator chimed again. A delivery man stepped out, carrying a bouquet of lilies. "For Mr. Callahan," he said. Ethan frowned. "From who?" "There's a card." He opened it. "To remind you that success means nothing if you forget to live." "Mom?" For a brief second, something shifted behind his calm expression, a flicker of guilt. Maybe sorrow. He placed the flowers on the table near the window, where sunlight spilled across the petals. The scent filled the room, faint but human. He sat back down, the quiet pressing in around him like a second skin. For years, he'd told himself loneliness was the price of greatness. Now, he wasn't so sure the trade had been worth it. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled soft, low, a promise of rain over the city. Ethan glanced up, watching the first drops streak down the glass. They fell in uneven trails, distorting the reflection of the man staring back at him. For the first time in a long while, he whispered to the empty room, "What am I even chasing anymore?" Outside, the rain grew heavier. Down below, people hurried under umbrellas, their lives small but real, filled with noise and warmth he could only imagine. And as the storm deepened, the intercom blinked once more. Julia's voice carried a different tone, this time almost excited. "Mr. Callahan, the new director, Madeline Hart, has just landed from London. She'll be here first thing Monday morning." Ethan leaned back, eyes still on the storm. A faint smile touched his lips. Not joy, not yet, just curiosity. Something or someone was coming. And for the first time in years, the thought didn't feel like a threat. It felt like the beginning of change. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving the city washed clean and quiet. Sunlight slid down the glass walls of Callahan Tower, streaking across the polished floors like liquid gold. In the corner office, Ethan's coffee sat untouched again. He'd been staring at the calendar, Monday, 8 hours a month, for a long time, without really seeing it. Today, she was coming. The woman the board wouldn't stop talking about, Madeline Hart. The elevator chimed softly in the distance, and somewhere down the hall, voices carried new, confident, steady. Ethan stood by the window, watching the city come alive below. He told himself she was just another executive, another strategist with an impressive resume and a temporary seat at the table. But there was a flicker of something restless beneath the surface, something he hadn't felt in years, curiosity. He heard her before he saw her, the crisp rhythm of her heels on marble, the low hum of polite greetings as she passed reception. And then the knock, 3 light taps, no hesitation. "Come in," he said. The door opened, and she stepped inside. She wasn't what he'd expected, not the polished charm or predictable softness of corporate diplomacy. Madeline Hart carried an air of calm authority, precise posture, measured breath, eyes that didn't flinch. She wore a charcoal suit, her hair pinned neatly, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Callahan," she greeted, her tone even, almost quiet, but every syllable carried weight. He nodded once. "Ms. Hart. Welcome to Callahan Enterprises. Thank you. The board has briefed me on the current challenges. I'd like to meet the leadership teams this morning, if possible. Direct, efficient, no small talk, no nervous laughter." Ethan's instinctive smile met the faintest curve of her lips, not warmth, but acknowledgement. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "I suppose you've heard plenty about me already." "I prefer to form my own impressions," she said, taking her seat. For a moment, silence filled the space between them, not uncomfortable, but dense, like the pause before a storm breaks. Ethan studied her as one might study a puzzle, a woman who seemed both perfectly composed and somehow impossible to predict. "Stanford," he said finally. 5 languages? Turned around 2 near-bankrupt brands before 35? Impressive. "Facts," she replied softly. "Not character." That made him raise an eyebrow. "And what do you think defines character?" Madeline's gaze didn't waver. "What a person does when no one is watching." The words lingered, simple, sharp, and true. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "You'll fit right in," he said, but deep down, he knew she wouldn't fit at all. She'd change things. He could feel it already. By mid-morning, the boardroom on the 50th floor buzzed with quiet anticipation. The executives, men and women Ethan had led for years, exchanged glances as Madeline connected her presentation to the large screen. She didn't introduce herself again, didn't charm the room. She went straight to the numbers. "This," she began, tapping the slide, "is where the cracks start to show." Ethan's brow furrowed. The screen displayed charts of declining engagement, customer satisfaction dipping across the brand's European hotels. She moved through each point with precision, calm voice, confident rhythm, cutting through excuses before they could form. "We've relied too long on legacy," she continued. "Our guests buy an experience, not a logo. Right now, that experience is outdated. Technology, service design, even our visual language, it's 10 years behind the world we claim to lead." Ethan felt the sting, though he'd never admit it. Around the table, people shifted in their seats, waiting for his reaction. But he stayed silent, eyes on her. There was something magnetic about the way she spoke, no arrogance, no flattery, only truth. When she finished, she looked directly at him. "If we keep doing what's safe, we'll survive. But if we dare to rebuild, we'll lead again. That's the difference between a company that endures and a company that inspires." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Ethan's voice broke the stillness. "You make it sound like we've lost our soul." Madeline didn't blink. "Maybe we have." The words hit deeper than she could have known. Ethan looked away, fingers tracing the edge of his pen. "Lost our soul." It echoed through his chest like an old truth suddenly dragged into the light. After the meeting, as people filed out, he stayed behind. So did she. The room smelled faintly of coffee and rain carried in from coats. Madeline gathered her notes quietly. He watched her, curious. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "You told the board everything that's wrong with the empire they built." "I didn't come here to protect pride," she replied. "I came to protect purpose." He almost smiled. And if I'm the reason it lost that purpose, she looked up. Then I suppose you'll have to decide what kind of leader you want to be. Her tone wasn't defiant. It was honest, disarmingly so. Ethan felt something shift inside him, subtle but undeniable. She turned to leave, but before reaching the door, she paused. "Mr. Callahan," she said, glancing back. "I understand you value control. I do too. But sometimes, control is just fear dressed in a suit." Then she was gone. The room felt different after she left, lighter, somehow. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty chair she'd occupied. He thought about the way she'd spoken, the steadiness of her voice. Most people entered his orbit trying to impress him. She'd walked straight through the gravity of his power and left him questioning it. Outside, the clouds began to gather again over the city. The reflection of the gray sky rippled across the glass walls of the building. Ethan pressed a hand to the window, feeling the cool surface under his palm. For years, he'd been the man with all the answers. Now, for the first time, he wanted to ask questions not about business, but about himself. The rain returned, tapping softly against the glass. Somewhere below, the city carried on, unaware that inside the tallest tower, a man who had everything had just met the one person who might undo him, not by taking his power, but by forcing him to see it differently. He watched the rain for a long time, and then, almost to himself, he murmured, "Madeline Hart." The name felt different on his lips. Not just a name, a beginning. The glass walls of the 50th floor boardroom shimmered beneath the morning sun. Outside, the skyline gleamed like polished steel. Inside, the air was heavy with the quiet tension that always preceded Ethan Callahan's meetings. The long oak table stretched like a runway, lined with executives in tailored suits. At the head sat Ethan, calm, confident, fingers resting lightly on a fountain pen. His expression was composed, but there was something different today, a faint spark of anticipation. The door opened, the sound of heels measured, unhurried, cut through the murmurs. Every head turned. Madeline Hart stepped inside, the same calm, precise energy as before. But now, under the bright light of the boardroom, she seemed even more unshakable. She carried no stack of papers, no air of apology, just presence. "Ms. Hart." Ethan greeted, standing slightly, his smile polished but warm. "Glad you could join us." Madeline nodded once, setting her tablet on the table. "I was told this company values punctuality. I intend to keep that standard." A few quiet chuckles rippled around the room. Ethan smiled wider, leaning back in his chair. "You'll find we value excellence above all else. And charm doesn't hurt either." That was when she looked directly at him, eyes steady, voice low but firm. "I came here to rebuild your brand, Mr. Callahan," she said, not to be charmed by it. Silence. The words landed like a small earthquake. Someone at the far end of the table coughed to hide a laugh. Ethan's pen stopped mid-tap. For a brief moment, he wasn't the billionaire CEO, just a man caught off guard. No one had ever spoken to him like that, certainly not in this room. He recovered quickly, but the curve of his smile faltered into something real. "Well," he said, after a pause that stretched a little too long, "that's refreshingly direct." Madeline didn't flinch. Honesty saves time. The meeting began. Charts appeared on screens, figures scrolled, voices traded facts and projections. But Ethan wasn't listening the way he usually did. He was watching the way Madeline moved through data like a composer through music, precise, effortless, utterly in command. When others hesitated, she filled the silence with clarity. When someone questioned her strategy, she replied not with defense, but with logic sharp enough to end debate. And yet, there was grace in her control, a gentleness in how she explained the harsh truths about their failing customer trust, their stagnant marketing, their tired luxury image. It wasn't rebellion, it was truth told without fear. He found himself leaning forward, elbows on the table. Every word she spoke seemed to cut through the fog of routine he'd lived in for years. The others were nodding now, even the skeptical ones. He could see it how her calm authority shifted the room's balance. For the first time in a long while, someone other than him held the center of gravity in this company. When the meeting ended, papers shuffled, chairs scraped back. The team dispersed quietly. Madeline gathered her notes, preparing to leave. Ethan stayed seated, eyes on her. "You handled them well," he said finally. She glanced up. It wasn't about handling them. It was about showing them the truth. And if they're not ready for the truth, she met his gaze, then maybe the company deserves to fail. He laughed softly, surprised. "You don't pull punches, do you?" "I don't believe in polishing rot," she said. "It only smells worse later." He studied her for a long moment, the faintest trace of amusement in his eyes. "You realize that's not exactly the way to make friends around here." "I didn't come to make friends," she replied, picking up her tablet. "I came to make change." When she left, the door clicked softly behind her. Ethan sat there, alone again, in the echo of his own office, the city glinting through the glass. He should have felt irritated no one challenged him like that. But instead, he felt something far stranger. He turned his chair toward the window, the city sprawling beneath him like a living thing. For years, he had been the one who commanded, who spoke, and others listened. Now, for the first time, someone had spoken to him as if he were simply human, flawed, unguarded, and perhaps in need of direction. He thought of her words, "I came to rebuild your brand, not to be charmed by it." The honesty of it unsettled him. For a long while, he stayed by the window, the hum of the city below like distant music. His reflection in the glass looked almost unfamiliar, less certain, more alive. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet voice whispered, "She's not impressed by what you've built. Ethan, she's going to make you build it again." Later that evening, long after the office had emptied, Ethan walked through the quiet halls of Callahan Tower. The lights dimmed automatically as he passed, casting long shadows across the glass walls. He found himself outside the strategy department, the new office they had assigned to Madeline. Through the half-open blinds, he saw her still there, sleeves rolled up, a single lamp illuminating stacks of reports. She wasn't reading them. She was rewriting them, line by line. Ethan stood in the hallway for a moment, unseen. He could have turned away, but he didn't. Something about the sight, the quiet focus, the unwavering steadiness held him in place. She wasn't doing this for him. She was doing it because it mattered, because it was the right thing to do. For a man who'd built his empire on control, that kind of conviction felt almost foreign. He exhaled softly, stepped back, and walked away. His reflection followed him in the glass, tall, solitary, thoughtful. For the first time, the silence of the building didn't feel empty. It felt expectant. That night, as he left the tower and the city lights blurred against the windshield of his car, Ethan realized something he hadn't dared admit before. Power could command obedience, but only truth could command respect. And Madeline Hart. She was truth, walking straight into his world, uninvited, unafraid. The rain began again, gentle against the glass, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Ethan glanced up through the windshield, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. He didn't know it yet, but the next time they met, nothing between them would be the same. The following morning, the sky over Manhattan was the color of brushed steel, and a low fog pressed against the glass of Callahan Tower. Inside the 50th floor boardroom, the atmosphere felt sharper than usual, anticipation humming quietly under the polite greetings and the shuffle of laptops being opened. Ethan arrived last, as he always did, every step measured, every button of his charcoal suit perfectly in place. He didn't rush, but the moment he entered, the room adjusted to him. Conversations faded, all eyes turned, and then they shifted again to Madeline Hart. She stood near the presentation screen, posture straight, her focus fixed on the tablet in her hand. Her composure had a quiet gravity that drew attention without demanding it. When she looked up, her expression was calm, almost serene, but her eyes held a kind of fire cold enough to be precise, warm enough to be human. Ethan noticed it right away. So did everyone else. "Good morning," she began. "I've spent the past week reviewing operations across every branch of Callahan Enterprises. What I've found is not failure, but stagnation, the kind that kills slowly and quietly." The screen behind her lit up. Graphs, charts, photos of hotel lobbies and customer reviews appeared in a seamless rhythm. Her voice stayed low, steady, but every word carried an edge. "Our technology is outdated by nearly a decade. Our digital experience is still designed for a world that no longer exists. Guests expect connection, personalization, and empathy. We offer them marble floors and scripted smiles." A few executives exchanged glances. One of them, an older man from the finance division, cleared his throat. "Ms. Hart, with all due respect, Callahan hotels are known for timeless elegance." Our clientele Madeline turned to him, gentle but firm. Timelessness shouldn't mean lifelessness. When the world moves forward and you stand still, even luxury becomes obsolete. Ethan leaned back, elbows resting on the arms of his chair, eyes never leaving her. There was no trace of nervousness in her tone, no attempt to soften the truth, just calm precision, the kind that could slice through pride without raising its voice. She continued. "Our brand message, perfection for the privileged, was powerful 15 years ago. Today, it alienates. The new generation doesn't want to be above the world. They want to belong to it. They seek stories, not status." Her words settled into the silence like pebbles dropped into deep water. Ethan watched the ripples spread across the room. He could feel it: discomfort, defensiveness, curiosity. Then she pressed the next slide. A world map appeared, dotted with red points across Europe and North America. Customer feedback over the last 12 months shows a 23% decline in repeat guests under 40. In hospitality terms, that's not a trend, it's a warning. Someone exhaled sharply. Another typed notes, trying to keep up. Ethan didn't move. His thoughts drifted back to something his father once told him. The moment you stop listening is the moment you start falling. He had dismissed that advice years ago. But now, hearing Madeline, he felt the truth of it again. She shifted to the final part of her presentation. "We need a digital rebirth, a shift from perfection to authenticity, from scripted service to emotional intelligence. It's not about luxury, it's about human connection." Ethan's gaze softened slightly. Human connection. The phrase echoed in him like a bell. When she finished, she set the tablet down and looked straight at him. "That's my proposal, Mr. Callahan. To rebuild not what you've built, but what it stands for." Silence again, the kind that tested the air. One of the board members finally spoke. "This sounds risky. We'd be throwing away decades of brand identity." Madeline nodded. "Sometimes the only way to save something is to let go of what's killing it." Ethan almost smiled. Almost. He recognized courage when he saw it, the same kind that used to live in him before comfort dulled its edges. He leaned forward, folding his hands. "And if I say no," Madeline didn't hesitate, "then I'll know you're not the man this company needs, and I'll book a flight back to London by morning." A quiet murmur rippled across the room. Ethan met her gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. It wasn't challenge, it was recognition. Two people who understood what it meant to risk everything for something they believed in. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Stay," he said. "Let's see if you're right." The room exhaled in unison. A few looked surprised, others relieved. Ethan only looked thoughtful. She had thrown a stone into the still water of his empire, and he couldn't deny it. The sound had woken something in him. After the meeting, when everyone left, he remained seated. The city stretched beyond the windows, sun breaking through the fog at last. He replayed her words in his mind: connection, authenticity, belonging, words that felt foreign in a world built on numbers and polish. He rose and walked toward the window, his reflection merging with the skyline. For years, he had equated silence with control. Now, the silence after her presentation felt different, alive, waiting. Down in the lobby, he caught sight of her leaving through the revolving glass doors, a single folder in her hand, her stride unhurried. The rain had started again, thin and silvery against the pavement. She didn't open her umbrella, just walked straight into it. Ethan watched her go, something unexplainable stirring in his chest. Maybe admiration, maybe envy, maybe the quiet realization that she was everything he'd forgotten how to be, unafraid of truth, unafraid of starting over. He stayed by the window long after she disappeared into the street below. The city pulsed under the gray light, restless, alive. He reached into his pocket for his phone, typed a message, then stopped before hitting send. The message read, "Lunch tomorrow. I'd like to hear more about this human connection." He hesitated, then deleted it. Some things weren't ready to be said. Not yet. He turned back to his desk, the scent of rain drifting in through the cracks of the window frame. For the first time in a long while, work didn't feel like routine. It felt like the edge of something new. Somewhere, deep inside, Ethan Callahan, the man who once believed he'd seen it all, was waking up again. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving the city glazed with light. Drops still clung to the edges of the window panes on the 50th floor, catching the sun and scattering it in fragments across the conference table. Ethan sat at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, staring at the plan Madeline had presented the day before. Her words echoed in his head: connection. Not perfection. They sounded simple, but they weren't. Nothing about change ever was. He'd built an empire on control, on being the man with answers. But now, for the first time in years, he had more questions than he could admit, even to himself. The truth was unsettling. He wasn't used to being challenged, not by the market, not by his board, and certainly not by a woman who refused to be impressed by him. A knock came at the door, soft, confident. He didn't look up. "Come in." Madeline stepped inside, folder in hand, posture as composed as ever. She didn't ask if it was a good time. She knew he'd make it one. "I need your final approval to move forward with the restructuring pilot," she said. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You work fast." Her tone stayed even. Time doesn't slow down for hesitation. "Mr. Callahan." That almost made him smile. Almost. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." She did. The air between them felt charged, but not tense like two chess players studying the next move. Ethan tapped a pen lightly against his desk. "I've been thinking about your plan," he said slowly. "You're asking me to tear apart the foundation of this company, the same foundation that's made it what it is today. I'm asking you to save it before it collapses under its own weight," she replied. He met her gaze. "And if I don't?" For a heartbeat, silence. Then her answer came, clear and calm. "Then I'll fly back to London tomorrow morning and take the offer waiting for me there." The words hit like a strike of lightning, clean, unapologetic, final. No threat, no emotion, just truth. Ethan sat back, surprised by how quickly his mind reacted, not with anger, but with something else. Fear, amusement, admiration. He couldn't tell, but he knew one thing: he didn't want her to leave. Not yet. He let the moment stretch. Then, a soft chuckle escaped him. "You don't bluff, do you?" "Never saw the point," she said simply. He studied her, really studied her, the set of her shoulders, the quiet steadiness in her eyes. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever hired. She wasn't there to climb or flatter or survive. She was there to build, and maybe, without knowing it, to break a few walls down, including his. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "All right," he said, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful. "I think I just found what this company needs most." Madeline raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" He smiled, slow and deliberate. "Someone who's not afraid of me." A small silence followed, the kind that carried more meaning than words could hold. Madeline looked at him for a long moment, then gathered her folder, her tone soft but steady. "You don't need people to fear you, Mr. Callahan. You need them to believe in what you're building." Ethan didn't respond right away. Something in that sentence landed deeper than he expected. Believe. It had been a long time since he'd believed in anything that wasn't measured in numbers. She stood, ready to leave, but paused at the door. "You'll have my updated timeline by the end of the day," she said. "Assuming, of course, you're still on board." He nodded. "I am, for now." She gave the faintest smile, not of victory, but understanding, then disappeared down the hall. The office was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It wasn't heavy or hollow. It felt like the pause after a deep breath, the kind that comes just before movement. Ethan turned his chair toward the window, watching the city stir below. Somewhere, in the stream of traffic and voices, life kept moving forward, oblivious to his small revolution in the making. He thought about what she'd said about belief. When was the last time he'd inspired that in anyone? When was the last time he'd even inspired it in himself? He glanced at the clock, just past 10. Most mornings, he'd already be buried in meetings by now, chasing deadlines that never seemed to end. Instead, he found himself reaching for his phone, opening the company's internal message system. To Madeline Hart, he typed, "Lunch, today, 1 p.m. I want to hear what belief looks like to you." Then he stared at the words for a moment and deleted them. He smiled quietly to himself. She was right. Some things didn't need to be said yet. Outside, the clouds began to break apart, sunlight cutting through in thin, hopeful lines. He could see the reflection of his own face in the glass, still the same man, but something in his eyes had shifted, the look of someone not yet changed, but no longer untouched. He rose from his chair, walked toward the boardroom, and called for his team. When they gathered, he simply said, "We're implementing Hart's proposal, effective immediately." There was surprise, even hesitation, but no one argued. The tone in his voice left no room for doubt. Yet behind that authority was something quieter, almost humble, the sound of a man who, for the first time, was ready to listen. Hours later, after the office had emptied and the city lights flickered on below, Ethan lingered at his desk, looking out over the skyline. His reflection met his gaze again, sharp suit, steady eyes, but a softer edge now. He remembered her parting words. "You need them to believe in what you're building." He whispered to the empty room, "Maybe I do." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and the hum of life far below. Somewhere in that endless rhythm of the city, a woman named Madeline Hart was already reshaping his world, not through power, but through truth. And Ethan Callahan, the man who once believed he'd mastered everything, was finally learning the first lesson of change: to let go. He turned off the lights, one by one, the glow fading into the skyline. The city didn't sleep, and tonight, neither would he. 2 weeks passed, and the rhythm of Callahan Enterprises began to shift quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. Then, like dawn creeping through a heavy fog, the change became impossible to ignore. The offices felt different, the meetings shorter, sharper, more alive, and at the center of it all was Madeline Hart. She had turned what Ethan once thought of as routine into motion. 3 pilot projects, each one daring, unexpected, and somehow already successful, had breathed life back into a company that had been running on habit. The new digital experience for guests, the employee retraining initiative, and the partnership with a sustainable design firm all completed ahead of schedule, all her doing. Ethan noticed the change in the air long before he admitted it to himself. The people around him spoke her name with a kind of cautious admiration, the kind they reserve for those who actually made things happen. Yet it wasn't the results that unsettled him. It was her. The way she carried herself, calm but unyielding, like someone who'd long ago learned how to belong anywhere without needing to prove it. Every morning, he found himself waiting for the sound of her voice in the hallway, that low, deliberate tone that seemed to steady even the most restless rooms. Every meeting, he caught himself watching her not for what she said, but for what she didn't. The pauses, the silences, the quiet confidence that made everyone else speak more carefully. It annoyed him, at first. That kind of control wasn't supposed to exist outside of him. One Thursday afternoon, they sat across from each other in the smaller strategy room overlooking the East River. The late sunlight turned the water below to bronze, flickering across the glass. Papers were spread between them, but neither of them seemed in a rush. Madeline was reviewing a new marketing brief, her pen tapping lightly against the edge of the table. "You really think people care about stories?" Ethan asked, leaning back. "Luxury buyers pay for escape, not emotion." She didn't look up. "Escape is emotion," she said simply. "People don't buy perfection. They buy how it makes them feel." He studied her for a moment, that familiar mix of irritation and intrigue stirring in him again. "You talk about feelings like they're part of the business plan. They always were," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "You just stopped noticing." The words weren't meant to sting, but they did. Ethan opened his mouth to reply, then stopped. She was right. He had stopped noticing a long time ago. Somewhere between ambition and exhaustion, the human side of success had slipped through his fingers. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You speak like someone who's already lived through the fall." Madeline smiled faintly. "You don't learn resilience from winning." A brief silence settled between them. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Outside, a seagull crossed the reflection of the sky on the water. Inside, something small and quiet shifted in him, a flicker of recognition, maybe, or respect. For the rest of the meeting, he found it hard to focus on the numbers. Her presence had a gravity that kept pulling him back. It wasn't attraction, not in the way he'd known it before, quick, physical, predictable. It was slower, deeper, like trying to read a language he didn't yet understand. Later that week, the board convened for an executive update. When Madeline walked into the room, conversation stopped. She spoke for 40 minutes, calm, organized, relentless. By the end, even the most skeptical members were nodding along. Ethan watched from his seat at the head of the table, an odd sense of pride washing through him. Not pride for her success, but for having been wise enough to listen. After the meeting, as the others filtered out, he stayed behind, pretending to check messages. She lingered too, gathering her notes. "You've made an impression," he said quietly. Madeline looked up, unreadable. "That wasn't the goal. No, I came to make progress, not impressions." He smiled. "And yet, somehow, you've done both." There was no reaction. She only adjusted the strap of her bag and said, "You're used to people performing for your approval. Mr. Callahan. That's not me." He tilted his head. "What makes you think I'm looking for approval?" Her gaze softened just slightly. "Because you notice when it's not given?" It was a small moment, but it hit harder than he expected. She was gone before he could respond, leaving him in the stillness of the glass-walled boardroom. The skyline reflected in the window behind her seat, and he stared at that reflection for a long time. He couldn't decide if he admired her courage or envied her detachment, maybe both. That night, He stayed late at the office again. Through the quiet hum of the city outside, he heard footsteps in the corridor. Madeline's office light was still on. He walked past, slowing just enough to glance through the open doorway. She sat there, hair slightly loose from the day, typing with that same calm focus he'd come to recognize. A cup of tea rested beside her laptop, long gone cold. He wanted to say something, anything. Offer her a ride, ask about the new project, even joke about her work habits. But something in her stillness stopped him. She didn't need saving. She didn't even need acknowledgement. She was exactly where she wanted to be. He continued walking, his reflection trailing him down the hall. In the elevator, he caught himself smiling, quietly, almost self-mockingly. He had met countless brilliant people in his life, investors, visionaries, competitors, but none had made him feel this, aware of himself, of what he lacked, of what he might still learn. When the elevator doors opened into the lobby, he stepped out into the cool night air. The city was still awake, neon signs flickering, voices blending with the rhythm of distant traffic. He looked up at the tower behind him, its top floors glowing faintly. Somewhere up there, she was still working. He slipped his hands into his pockets, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. He didn't know where this was going, this strange pull between admiration and curiosity. But he knew one thing, with quiet certainty he was beginning to look forward to seeing her. Not because she challenged him, not because she impressed him, but because she didn't care to. And for a man who had spent his life surrounded by people trying to please him, that was the most disarming thing of all. As he turned toward the street, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain again. He paused, looking back once at the tower. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement like 1,000 small possibilities. He didn't smile this time. He just breathed, because for the first time in years, he felt something new. Anticipation. The office was quieter than usual that evening. The city outside had already begun to soften into gold, and the reflection of the skyline stretched across the glass walls like liquid fire. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving behind the faint hum of computers and the low, steady rhythm of rain against the windows. Ethan was still at his desk, sleeves rolled up, scanning through the numbers Madeline had sent earlier that day. Everything about her work was efficient, clean, flawless, just like her. He glanced at his watch. Almost 8. He should have left hours ago, but lately, he found himself staying later just long enough to see her light still on 2 floors below. There was something oddly grounding about it, knowing she was there, working with that quiet intensity he'd come to recognize. It reminded him of who he used to be before everything became a performance. He rose, jacket over his arm, planning to call it a night. But as he passed the corner office near the end of the hall, he stopped. Her door was slightly ajar. A faint voice floated through, sharp, low, and tense. "No, Daniel, I told you this isn't the time," Madeline's voice said, barely above a whisper, but strained enough to draw him closer. He froze, instinct warring with curiosity. Her tone wasn't one he'd ever heard before. There was something raw in it, something that didn't belong to the composed strategist he knew. He took a slow step closer. The rain outside masked the sound of his footsteps. "You don't get to call me after what you did," she said again, her accent softening under emotion, a trace of London threading through the words. "I lost everything because of you. My name, my career, my reputation." Ethan's hand tightened slightly around the edge of the doorway. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but something in her pain held him still. "I don't care what you think you can fix," she continued, her voice shaking now. "You lied. You dragged me into your fraud, and you let me take the fall. Don't you dare talk about forgiveness." A pause. Then, quieter. "No, you're right. I don't hate you, but I can't forget. I won't." The call ended with a soft click, followed by silence. Ethan stepped back quickly, pretending to be just walking by as she opened the door. Madeline froze for a second, startled to see him there. "Sorry," he said gently. lifting a hand. Didn't mean to. Her expression was calm again, but her eyes gave her away. There was a flicker of something fear, maybe, or shame before she forced a smile. "It's fine. Just a business call." He tilted his head, sounded personal. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she sighed, stepping aside. "You might as well come in." Her office was dim except for the desk lamp, its glow catching the faint sheen of rain on the window. Ethan leaned against the wall while she sat, staring at the phone in her hand. "Daniel," she said finally, "my ex-fiancé. We worked together years ago. He was in venture capital. Brilliant, charming, dangerous in the way people who always get their way tend to be." Ethan said nothing. He waited. He ran a scheme. She continued quietly. "A fake investment loop. I didn't know, at least, not until it was too late. The funds ran through my name, my signature. When everything fell apart, he disappeared. I took the hit. Lost every contract I'd ever built." Her voice didn't shake now. It was steady, almost too steady, like someone telling a story they could practice not to feel. Ethan crossed his arms, studying her. "And you rebuilt everything, alone." She nodded once. "That's the part no one likes to hear. They want a story of redemption. I just survived." There was no self-pity in her tone, just truth, simple and bare. He admired that more than he could say. For a while, they sat in the quiet hum of rain and city light. Then Ethan spoke softly. "He called you tonight because he wants something, doesn't he?" She looked up, meeting his eyes. People like him always do. Something in the way she said it struck him a mixture of strength and exhaustion, as if she'd spent years building armor she no longer wanted to wear. He stepped closer, careful not to break the fragile calm between them. "You don't owe him your silence," he said. She gave a small, sad smile. "And you don't owe me your concern." That should have been the end of it. But he didn't move. He couldn't. "You're right," he said, "but concern isn't always a debt. Sometimes it's just respect." Madeline turned away, pretending to adjust the stack of files on her desk. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying what her voice didn't. "Respect doesn't rebuild reputations. Mr. Callahan." "No," he said quietly. "But it can rebuild people." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was fragile, like glass about to crack. Finally, she exhaled and leaned back in her chair. "You shouldn't have heard that conversation." "Maybe," he said. "But maybe I was supposed to." She looked at him then. Really looked. And for the first time, the wall between them felt thinner, not gone, but cracked enough for light to seep through. He didn't press her further. He only nodded once and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused. "For what it's worth," he said softly, "whatever that man took from you, he didn't take your integrity. That's rarer than reputation." Her eyes softened, a faint shimmer beneath the dim light. "You're better at words than I expected," she murmured. He smiled faintly. "Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my image." Then he left, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. Madeline sat there long after he'd gone, the rain whispering against the glass. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of that old story pressing so hard against her chest. Someone had heard it and hadn't looked at her with pity, only understanding. Outside, the storm began to ease, the lights of the city softening into a gentle blur. And in another part of the tower, Ethan Callahan stood by the window of his office, replaying her words, feeling something inside him settle. He had seen her strength before, but now he'd seen her scars. And somehow, that made her even more impossible to ignore. The morning after the storm, the city woke slow and gray. A thin mist hung over the streets, softening the edges of the world. Down in the cafe on the ground floor of Callahan Tower, the air smelled faintly of roasted beans and rain-damp coats. Ethan sat by the window, a black coffee cooling untouched in front of him. For once, he wasn't early for a meeting, he was waiting for her. Madeline arrived quietly, as she always did, her movements efficient yet unhurried. She wore no makeup today, just a light gray coat, her hair pulled loosely back, the kind of simplicity that drew attention without asking for it. She noticed him immediately, hesitated for a moment at the doorway, then walked over. "You picked a strange place for a meeting," she said, setting her tablet down. "It's not a meeting," Ethan replied, "just coffee." "Between a CEO and his employee," she asked, half smiling. He shrugged. "Between two people who've both had a long week." She studied him for a beat, then nodded, sitting across from him. The space between them was small, yet it carried the weight of everything unspoken, their history of guarded words, unacknowledged respect, and that invisible line neither of them had dared to cross. Outside, rain slid slowly down the glass. The city's reflection wavered in each drop. Inside, for once, neither of them felt like speaking about work. "I heard you left early last night," she said softly. "I tried," he replied. "Didn't work." A small pause. "Because of what you overheard?" He shook his head. "Because of what I understood." Madeline looked away, her fingers tightening around the cup. "It's not something I talk about," she said. "I know," he said gently. "That's why I wanted to listen." Her eyes lifted then, meeting his. There was no pity in his face, only stillness, the kind that allowed someone to breathe. "You're stronger than you think." "Madeline," he said quietly. "Most people break when they're betrayed like that. You built something out of it." She tried to deflect with a faint laugh. "That's one way to describe stubbornness. Stubbornness is just courage that stayed too long," he said. The corners of her lips softened, but she said nothing. For a while, they just sat there, letting the silence settle around them, the clatter of dishes, the soft hum of conversation, the hiss of milk steaming behind the counter. It all faded into a kind of calm. Ethan watched her as she stared out the window, her reflection faint against the fogged glass. He wondered how many years she had carried that story inside her, how many times she had rebuilt herself quietly, without anyone noticing. He took a slow breath. "You ever think about forgiving him?" Madeline turned her gaze back to him. "Every day. Forgiveness isn't the hard part. Trusting myself again is." Her honesty hit him deeper than he expected. It wasn't the kind of vulnerability that asked for sympathy. It was strength admitting its limits. He nodded, his voice low. "I know that feeling." She tilted her head slightly. "Do you?" He smiled without humor. "When my father died, I thought running the company perfectly would keep his ghost proud. It didn't. It just kept me busy enough to avoid the quiet." Her expression softened. "You talk like a man who's tired of being invincible." He gave a small nod. "Maybe I am." A beat of quiet followed, long enough that both of them looked down at the same time, like the moment had said too much. Then, without thinking, Ethan reached across the table and rested his hand over hers. It was brief, barely a touch, but the warmth of it lingered. Madeline didn't pull away, her fingers stilled under his, her pulse steady but present. When she looked up, there was something new in her eyes, something quiet, fragile, real. "This isn't a good idea," she said softly. "I know." "Then why does it feel calm?" He didn't answer, because calm was the right word. It wasn't fire, it wasn't infatuation, it was recognition. Outside, a cab splashed through a puddle, scattering raindrops against the window. Inside, time slowed. For once, Ethan didn't feel the need to control the moment. He just let it be. She pulled her hand back gently, wrapping both palms around her cup as if to gather herself. "We should get back," she murmured. He nodded, though his voice was quieter than usual. "We should." Neither of them moved right away. The air between them had shifted, not in grand gestures or declarations, but in something far subtler, the kind of change you only notice when silence feels different. When they finally stood, Ethan held the door for her. The cool air from outside brushed against them, carrying the faint scent of rain and roasted coffee. She paused for half a second beside him, eyes forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said. "For what? For not seeing me as what happened to me." He turned slightly toward her, his expression softening. "I don't," he said. "I see who you became after. And for a moment, that was enough." They walked back toward the elevators side by side, saying nothing more. Their reflections moved together in the mirrored walls, close but not touching. When the elevator doors slid open, Madeline stepped inside first. Ethan stayed behind, letting the doors close between them. As her silhouette disappeared, he caught his own reflection, half shadow, half light, and thought to himself how strange it was that understanding someone else could make him feel more understood. Up above, the rain began again, light and steady, like a rhythm only they could hear. And somewhere between the noise of the city and the quiet of their thoughts, something unspoken began to grow delicate, unexpected, impossible to name. But they both felt it, and neither tried to stop it. The air in Miami was heavy that evening, thick with humidity and the low, restless sound of waves crashing beyond the glass walls of the hotel. The sky had darkened hours earlier, and now a tropical storm pressed against the coastline, rain slanting sideways, drumming against the windows in erratic bursts. Lightning flickered, quick and white, illuminating the dim suite for half a second before dissolving back into gray. Ethan stood near the balcony doors, his reflection rippling faintly in the glass. He'd been through dozens of business trips like this, in cities that looked different but somehow always felt the same. Yet tonight, everything felt sharper, more alive. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was her. Madeline sat at the small table, laptop open, her posture straight despite the hour. She'd been quiet since the flight, focused, efficient, as if she could outrun exhaustion with discipline. But now, her concentration was starting to crack. She glanced toward the windows each time thunder rolled through the room, her breath catching almost imperceptibly. Ethan noticed. "You all right?" he asked gently. She nodded too quickly. "Fine. Just can't focus with the noise." Another flash of lightning tore across the horizon, followed by a thunderclap that rattled the glasses on the table. Madeline flinched. Her hands froze mid-gesture, knuckles pale. He took a small step closer. "You're afraid of storms." Her laugh was quiet, but unconvincing. Afraid is a strong word. He tilted his head slightly. "Strong doesn't mean invincible?" For a moment, neither spoke. The rain grew louder, filling the silence between them. Then she pushed the laptop aside and rose, crossing her arms as if bracing herself. "I just don't like not being in control," she said, her voice low. Ethan watched her, remembering the way she'd spoken about her past, the betrayal, the loss, the rebuilding. Control had become her armor, her way to make the world predictable again. But nature didn't negotiate. Another thunderclap struck close, shaking the windows. She startled visibly this time, stepping back from the balcony. Before she could turn away completely, he moved toward her, slow, careful. "Hey," he said softly. "It's okay." She shook her head, eyes fixed on the storm outside. "I know it's irrational. When it gets that close, I feel..." She stopped, couldn't find the words. Ethan closed the distance between them, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to explain." And before she could protest, he reached for her hand. It was a simple gesture, steady, wordless, but the warmth of his touch broke something open in her. For a heartbeat, she tried to pull away. Then she stopped, let herself breathe. The storm outside raged on. Inside, there was stillness. He guided her a few steps back from the window until they stood near the small couch facing the city. "Sit," he said gently. She did. He sat beside her, close enough that she could hear the even rhythm of his breathing. Lightning flared again, casting their reflections onto the glass. Madeline's shoulders tensed. Ethan's hand found hers again, fingers brushing lightly. "Breathe with me," he murmured, slow, in and out. She tried. The first breath shook. The next steadied. The thunder rolled again. But now it felt farther away. When she finally looked up, her eyes met his. Something in them shifted fear, giving way to gratitude. Gratitude softening into something quieter. "You don't have to stay," she said, though her voice had lost its edge. "I know," he replied. "That's why I am." A silence followed, long, fragile, unbroken, the kind that hums with words too heavy to speak aloud. Outside, rain still lashed against the glass, but it no longer sounded angry. It was just there, a rhythm to the quiet between them. When he reached up, his hand brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. His fingertips lingered for only a moment, tracing the faint tremor of breath that left her lips. She didn't move, didn't pull away, and then, slowly, as if guided by something neither of them could stop, he leaned closer. The kiss came not with urgency, but with stillness, soft, careful, like two people remembering how to be human again. There was no hunger in it, no rush, just warmth, understanding, the slow exhale of two souls finding a place to rest. When it broke, neither of them spoke. Madeline's eyes stayed closed for a second longer, her forehead resting lightly against his. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "Probably not," he said quietly, "but you don't regret it." "No." She opened her eyes, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Neither do I." Outside, the storm began to ease. The rain softened into a gentle drizzle, the thunder retreating into the distance. The sound of waves returned, low and steady. They stayed there for a long while, side by side on the couch, their hands still intertwined. The air felt lighter now. Not because the storm had passed, but because, in some unspoken way, they had both stopped fighting their own. At some point, Madeline leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't move, he only let her rest there. The faint scent of her hair mixing with the ocean breeze that slipped through the cracks in the door. No promises, no explanations, just quiet. Later, when the city had settled back into stillness and the storm was nothing more than a memory, Ethan looked down at her, her breathing slow, her expression calm. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked unguarded. He whispered her name once, barely audible, as if testing the sound of it in the dark. She didn't stir. Outside, the last drops of rain traced their way down the glass, catching the city lights like threads of silver, and in that fragile space between exhaustion and peace, Ethan realized something he hadn't let himself feel in years. He didn't want the night to end, because this wasn't desire. It wasn't conquest. It was healing, and he wasn't sure which of them needed it more. The morning light in Miami came soft and golden, spilling gently across the hotel room. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so fragile that even the sound of waves felt like a whisper. Ethan woke first. For a moment, he didn't move. He just watched the faint curve of Madeline's shoulder as she slept beside him, her breathing even, calm. Something about it felt unreal, like the world had stopped spinning long enough for them to catch their breath. He hadn't expected this, not the quiet, not the tenderness, and definitely not the ache that came with knowing it couldn't last. When she stirred, her eyes opened slowly, finding him already awake. There was no awkwardness, no rush to speak, just the kind of stillness that only comes when words would be too heavy. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning," she murmured, voice husky with sleep. She sat up, pulling the sheet around her, and for a moment, the sunlight hit her face just right warm. Unguarded, human. He wanted to memorize that version of her. the one that didn't belong to boardrooms or battlefields. "Ethan," she said quietly, after a pause, "we should talk." He smiled faintly. "That sounds dangerous." "It is," she said, turning to face him, "because whatever this is, it can't leave this room." He studied her, the light fading slightly in his expression. "You think what happened was a mistake?" She hesitated. "No. It was real, but real doesn't mean simple." She pulled her hair back, taking a slow breath. "You're my boss. I'm your employee. People would twist this into something ugly. They always do." He nodded slowly. "Then let them? I don't care." "I do," she said, her tone sharper now, not out of anger, but fear. "I've worked too hard to rebuild my name. I won't risk losing it again, not even for you." He looked at her then. Really looked, and saw it. The tremor behind her calm. The years of fighting to be taken seriously. The scars that didn't show. "All right," he said quietly. "We keep it between us." She exhaled, relief and sadness mixed in one breath. "You mean that?" He nodded once. "I'd rather have something real and secret than something hollow in the open." For a while, neither of them moved. The sunlight shifted, laying long stripes of gold across the sheets. The sound of the ocean below carried faintly through the half-open door. Madeline looked down at her hands, then said softly, "I can't be a chapter in your story. Ethan. I can't be another one of your passing things." He leaned forward, his voice low, certain. "You're not a chapter. Madeline, you're the book I want to write to the very end." Her breath caught slightly. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because I might believe you." A small silence fell between them again, gentle, but charged. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away this time. "After a while," she whispered, "promise me something. Anything. Promise me this won't change who we are at work. No favoritism, no gossip, no weakness." He smiled, a touch of pride in his eyes. "You think I'd risk underestimating you?" She smiled faintly back. "No, I think you already don't know how not to care." They both laughed softly at that, the kind of laugh that felt like breathing again after holding it for too long. As the morning stretched on, they got dressed in quiet harmony, moving around each other with the ease of something unspoken but deeply known. When they finally left the room, they did so as colleagues again, no trace of the night except for the way their eyes lingered a fraction too long. The hotel lobby was filled with the smell of coffee and fresh linen. A few guests moved past them, oblivious. To everyone else, they were just two professionals on a business trip. To each other, they were something that neither title could define. On the drive to the airport, the sky was pale and endless, streaked with light clouds. Madeline sat by the window, her expression thoughtful. Ethan kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting against his knee, resisting the urge to reach for hers. At a red light, she turned to him. "You're quiet," she said. "So are you. Are you regretting it?" He shook his head. "No. I'm realizing how much it means." Her gaze softened. "That's what scares me." The light turned green. He didn't answer, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with awareness. When they reached the airport, they both hesitated before stepping out of the car. He grabbed her luggage from the trunk, their hands brushing for the briefest second. "I'll see you in New York," she said. He nodded. "You will." As she turned to leave, he called after her, "Madeline." She looked back. He took a slow breath. "No matter what happens next, I meant what I said." Her eyes held his for a long moment, the noise of the terminal blurring around them. And what was that exactly? That you're not temporary. Something flickered across her face, half pain, half wonder. Then she smiled, that quiet, knowing smile he was learning to love. "Then let's see if you can keep that promise," she said softly. And with that, she disappeared into the crowd. Ethan stood there for a while, watching until she was gone, The wind from the sliding doors brushed against him, cool and fleeting. He realized, for the first time in years, that he wasn't thinking about the next deal, or the next acquisition, or the next step on his ladder. He was thinking about her, about the way she had looked at him just before walking away, and he knew whatever they had begun, it wasn't finished. It had only just started to breathe. Back in the car, he sat for a moment before starting the engine. The city shimmered in the heat, alive and unpredictable. He smiled to himself then, quiet and certain. Some promises, he thought, weren't meant to be kept easily. They were meant to be lived. It started on a Tuesday morning, the kind that felt too ordinary to carry the weight of anything dangerous. The sky over Manhattan was pale and cold, the kind of gray that blurred the city's edges. Ethan was in a meeting when his phone buzzed twice an unfamiliar number. He ignored it the first time. The second time. It came with a message. "Tell your strategist I'm back. I think the board deserves to know the truth." The name beneath it was Daniel Reeves. Ethan froze. The room went on talking around him, voices fading into static. He read the message again, slower this time, his jaw tightening. The board deserves to know the truth. He knew enough about that tone about men who use power like a weapon. When the meeting ended, he found her in her office. Madeline was standing by the window, her reflection caught against the skyline. One look at his face, and she knew. "He's here," she said softly. He nodded. "He texted me." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then it's already started. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of everything they both understood without needing to say. Ethan wanted to fix it, to protect her, to shield her from every whisper that might come. But she wasn't a woman who needed saving, and that was exactly why he loved her. "What does he want?" Ethan asked. "Control," she said simply. "It's all he's ever wanted. He's probably going to the board to tell them about the scandal. Twist it. Make me look complicit." Ethan's voice was steady, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "Then we tell them first." Her eyes widened. "No. If this comes from me, it'll sound defensive. If it comes from you, it'll sound like truth," he interrupted. "And it will be." She looked away, toward the city below. Her reflection in the glass looked smaller somehow, though her voice stayed calm. "You don't owe me that, Ethan." He stepped closer, his tone soft but certain. "This isn't about owing. This is about what's right." Madeline turned then, finally meeting his eyes. "If I'd let you do this, I'll owe myself nothing." That night, she didn't go home. She stayed in the office long after the lights dimmed, drafting a statement. Ethan passed her door twice, each time wanting to tell her to rest, each time stopping himself. This was her battle to face, and she was already fighting it with grace. By dawn, her decision was made. She sent a message to the board, requesting an emergency meeting. No lawyers, no intermediaries, just her and the truth. The meeting room at Callahan Enterprises had never felt more still. Outside, the sky was streaked with the faint blue of morning. Inside, 10 members of the board sat around a polished oak table, waiting. Madeline walked in alone. No makeup, no notes, just her. She didn't look like a woman on trial. She looked like a woman who had already survived one. "Before you hear anything from anyone else," she began, "I want you to hear it from me." The room was silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. "Years ago," she continued, "I worked with Daniel Reeves. We were engaged. He was brilliant, persuasive, and he used both to run an investment fraud I didn't see until it was too late. The funds went through accounts in my name. When the investigation began, he disappeared. I didn't. I stayed. I faced the questions. I lost my job, my reputation, and everything I thought I knew about myself. I spent years rebuilding not to erase it, but to prove to myself that I could be more than what he made me look like." Her voice didn't shake, but there was something in it, a depth, a worn steadiness that quieted the entire room. "If any of you believe this disqualifies me," she said finally, "I understand. But I won't let him define my story again. Not here." A pause. Then, behind her, a voice spoke, "Nor will I." Ethan stepped into the room. He hadn't been invited, but he didn't need to be. He walked straight to her side, his presence filling the silence like an anchor. "Everything she said is true," he told the board. "And what's also true is that without her, this company wouldn't be standing where it is today. If integrity means owning our past, then Madeline Hart is the most qualified person in this building to speak about it." Someone at the table cleared their throat. "Mr. Callahan, are you speaking as CEO or as a man who believes in facts?" Ethan interrupted. His tone stayed calm, but his eyes didn't waver. "And the fact is, she's not the one who should be ashamed." Madeline turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his. For the first time, the fear in her eyes softened just enough for gratitude to find its way in. When the meeting adjourned, the board filed out quietly. No verdict, no drama, just thought, and that was enough. Ethan and Madeline stayed behind. The sunlight had begun to fill the room, warming the cold glass and the polished wood. She exhaled slowly, leaning back against the table. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied. "But you did." He nodded once. "You would have done the same." She smiled faintly. "Maybe. But I wouldn't have looked half as intimidating." He laughed softly, a sound that cut through the weight of the morning. Then, after a pause, he said he's not going to stop. "You know, Daniel." Her smile faded. "No, but neither will I." He admired that about her, the quiet defiance, the courage that didn't need to shout. "You've got people now," he said. "You've got me." She looked at him for a long moment, eyes searching, voice barely above a whisper. "That's the part that scares me." "Why?" "Because I've finally built a life I don't want to lose." The words hung there, suspended between them. As the city began to stir awake outside, he took a slow breath, his voice steady. "Then we'll protect it. Together." Madeline didn't answer. She just looked at him. Really looked like she was seeing him for the first time. Not as the man who led the empire, but as the man who stood beside her without hesitation. Outside, the morning light grew brighter, washing the skyline in gold. The past was still there, lingering at the edges, but it no longer defined the day. And for the first time since Daniel's shadow reappeared, Madeline felt something she hadn't in years. Not victory, not relief, peace. A quiet kind of peace that came from knowing she no longer had to stand alone. The morning of the hearing came with a quiet tension that clung to the air like fog. The boardroom on the top floor of Callahan Tower had been rearranged, chairs lined along one side, the long mahogany table gleaming under the pale light. Outside, the city pulsed as usual, unaware that, inside this glass box, a reckoning was about to take place. Madeline arrived early. She wore black sharp, composed, without a trace of fear, but her eyes, if you looked closely enough, carried the weight of sleepless nights. In one hand, she held a slim folder. In the other, her phone, with a single message still open. It was from Ethan, sent an hour earlier. "Whatever happens, I'm here." All the way through, she slipped the phone away and exhaled. This wasn't about him. It wasn't even about Daniel anymore. This was about reclaiming the one thing that had been taken from her without permission, her name. By the time the board members filed in, the air felt charged. Conversations hushed when Daniel Reeves entered, dressed impeccably, his smile too confident, too rehearsed. He looked at Madeline as though he were greeting an old flame instead of the woman he'd tried to destroy. Still playing the martyr. "I see," he murmured, low enough for only her to hear. Madeline didn't look at him. "No," she said softly, "just playing fair." Ethan entered a few minutes later. His presence changed the room instantly. Calm authority followed him like a shadow. When he met Madeline's eyes across the table, a flicker of quiet strength passed between them, unspoken but understood. The chairwoman called the meeting to order. "We are here to discuss allegations made against Ms. Madeline Hart by Mr. Daniel Reeves regarding past professional misconduct. Ms. Hart has requested to address the board directly." Madeline stood. She didn't bring notes. She didn't need them. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady, even. "A few weeks ago, I was informed that my past would be brought to this table, not as context, but as a weapon. So, before it's used against me, I'll use it honestly." A few members shifted uncomfortably. Daniel's smirk didn't falter. "I was accused once," she continued, "of aiding in a financial fraud led by this man." She gestured calmly toward Daniel. "At the time, I was his fiancée and his partner in business. I trusted him. I signed documents without questioning him. When it all collapsed, he vanished, and I stayed. I faced the investigation, cooperated fully, and was cleared of any wrongdoing." Daniel leaned forward. "That's one way to tell it," he said with a thin smile. Madeline looked directly at him now, her gaze sharp enough to silence him. "It's the only way to tell it when you have proof." She opened the folder and slid a series of papers across the table bank records. Signed testimonies. A certified letter from the London Financial Authority. "These are the findings from the case. And these," she nodded to the small pile beside them, "are emails from Mr. Reeves to investors, written under a false corporate alias. I've also brought a witness." The door opened. A woman in her 50s stepped in, composed but nervous. "This is Ms. Caroline Marsh," Madeline said. "Former financial analyst at Reeves Capital. She was pressured to falsify reports. She refused and was dismissed without cause." "Ms." Marsh spoke quietly but firmly. Her testimony was short, precise, irrefutable. By the time she finished, the room had shifted. The confidence on Daniel's face began to crack, thin as glass under pressure. Ethan didn't speak during any of it. He didn't have to. He simply watched Madeline, how she stood unflinching, how she used truth like armor. He realized, in that moment, that her strength wasn't in surviving pain, it was in refusing to let it make her bitter. When the chairwoman finally spoke, her tone was deliberate. "Mr. Reeves, do you deny these documents are authentic?" Daniel swallowed. I would need time to review." "You've had years," Madeline interrupted softly. The chairwoman nodded once, then turned to Madeline. "You've handled yourself with remarkable grace, Ms. Hart. This board stands by you. These allegations are officially dismissed. It was done, just like that. A few murmurs, the scrape of chairs, and then silence." Madeline stood still for a moment, as if her body hadn't caught up to the truth yet. Ethan approached her slowly, giving her space. "You did it," he said quietly. She looked up at him, eyes bright with something deeper than relief. "No," she said. "We did." For the first time in years, the word clean meant something real. Not spotless, not perfect, just honest. Daniel left the building under a cloud of whispers, the kind that cling and spread. He didn't look back, but Madeline did not at him, but at the city beyond the glass, sunlight cutting through the fog. Later, she and Ethan stepped outside together. The air was cool, the street below alive with sound. She paused on the sidewalk, her hands still trembling slightly. "Feels strange," she said softly. "Winning?" He smiled. "It's not strange. It's overdue." They walked in silence for a while, the kind of quiet that feels like healing. When they reached the corner, she stopped. "You know," she said, "I used to think redemption was something you earned. Now I think it's something you claim." Ethan looked at her with quiet admiration. "And you just did." A car passed, splashing through a puddle. The reflection of the tower shimmered on the wet street, bending in the water but never breaking. He took her hand, not for show, not to save her, just to share the stillness of the moment. She didn't pull away. In his world, victory had always meant numbers, headlines, applause. But today, standing beside her, he learned that real victory was silent, steady, built on truth, not triumph. When she finally looked up at him, the faintest smile touched her lips. "You believed me when you didn't have to." "I didn't need proof," he said softly. "I just needed you." For a long moment, they stood there under the morning light, the city moving around them, unbothered. Madeline Hart had her name back. Ethan Callahan had something far rarer clarity. And though neither said it aloud, they both knew this was not the end of the storm. But it was, finally, the beginning of peace. The weeks that followed felt quieter, not empty, just softer, as though the noise that used to fill Ethan's world had finally found its volume. The boardroom no longer felt like a battlefield, and the people who once looked to him for commands began to look to Madeline for direction too. She handled it with grace, never competing, never yielding. Together, they built something that resembled balance. In the mornings, they passed each other in the hall with nothing more than a polite nod. But there was always that flicker in their eyes, a shared memory of nights when silence spoke louder than words. They never crossed the line at work again, not because they didn't want to, but because respect had grown deeper than desire. Ethan had changed. The man who once measured worth in deals and dominance now paused to listen. He found himself asking questions instead of giving answers, watching people instead of judging them. He had learned something simple, something profound from her. That power wasn't in control, it was in understanding. Madeline noticed it too. The sharp edges that once framed him had softened. His voice carried more calm than command. When he spoke in meetings, he no longer needed to fill the room, his presence already did. And when she looked at him now, she didn't see the billionaire everyone feared. She saw the man who once stood beside her when the world was ready to turn away. One late afternoon, after a long presentation to potential investors, they found themselves in the elevator together for the first time in weeks. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was familiar, like a melody that no longer needed words. The doors closed, and the hum of the machinery filled the space. "Good presentation," he said finally. "Yours too," she replied with a faint smile. He hesitated. "You've been avoiding me." She turned slightly. "I've been busy, he repeated, a small laugh in his throat. "Right. Don't make it sound personal," she said softly. He looked at her then, his tone low. "It's hard not to." The elevator stopped at her floor, and she stepped out without turning. Then, "Try harder. Mr. Callahan." He smiled as the doors closed again. It wasn't rejection, it was boundary. And for once in his life, he respected it. That night, back in his office, he watched the city lights flicker against the glass. His reflection stared back a man no longer untouched by humility. He thought of her words, her calm, her quiet strength, and he realized something he hadn't known he was missing. Peace didn't come from being right. It came from being real. Madeline, meanwhile, found herself thinking of him too. Often in small moments, the way he now listened when junior staff spoke, the way he deflected praise toward others, the way he smiled, just a little softer these days. She caught herself caring in ways that scared her. Caring, not because she needed him, but because she finally believed she could love someone without losing herself. One evening, they both stayed late. The office was empty, the sky outside dimming into that blue-gray twilight that softened the edges of everything. She was gathering her notes when he appeared at her door. "Coffee?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. 10 minutes. They walked down to the small cafe across the street. It had become their neutral ground, neither his world nor hers, just space to breathe. They sat by the window, the city glowing beyond. I don't know when it happened, Ethan said quietly, stirring his drink, but I stopped caring what people think of me. Madeline smiled. That's not true. You care. You've just learned to care differently. He looked up, studying her. You always do that. What? Find the truth in everything I try to simplify. She tilted her head slightly. Maybe you just needed someone to remind you that you're human. He chuckled softly. You make it sound like I was something else before. You were, she said. Lonely. The word lingered between them, heavier than either expected. He didn't deny it. You know, he said after a moment, I used to think love was supposed to be fire loud, consuming, impossible to ignore. And now, she asked. Now, he said, his voice quieter, I think it's supposed to be quiet enough that you can still hear yourself think. Madeline smiled, her gaze softening. That's called growing up, or falling differently, he said. A soft laugh escaped her lips. She looked out the window, where rain had started to fall lightly, blurring the reflections on the glass. You've changed, she said. Maybe I just finally met someone worth changing for. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world outside disappeared. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. The connection was already there, steady, mature, patient. Later that week, they worked side by side on a major project launch. There were moments when their hands brushed, when their eyes lingered a beat too long, but the energy between them was no longer about temptation. It was about trust, about knowing that love could grow quietly without needing to be declared every minute. Ethan began taking Sundays off, something unheard of before. He started visiting his mother again, calling old friends he'd lost touch with, even reading the book Madeline had once mentioned over coffee. Madeline, in turn, began to sleep through the night again. No more restless dreams of betrayal or loss. No more waiting for the other shoe to drop. She felt seen not as a survivor, not as an asset, but as a woman finally at peace with herself. One evening, after another long day, Ethan walked her to her car. The city was still buzzing, but the air felt calm, the kind that hinted at summer just around the corner. Madeline, he said softly. She turned. I don't know what this is supposed to look like. He said, us, whatever we're becoming. She smiled faintly. Maybe it's not supposed to look like anything. Maybe it's just supposed to feel right. And does it? She paused, then nodded. Yes, it does. They stood there for a moment, under the dim glow of the streetlight, the noise of the world fading into the distance. He didn't reach for her hand this time. He didn't have to. Some loves don't need to be touched to be real. They just need time to breathe, to become. As she drove away, Ethan stood on the curb, watching the taillights fade. There was no ache this time, no longing wrapped in uncertainty, only gratitude, because what they had was no longer fragile. It was steady, it was earned, and for the first time in both their lives, it was love that didn't hurt. The sun over Los Angeles burned bright that afternoon, sharp against the glass of the conference tower where the Callahan team had gathered. The air smelled faintly of ocean salt and ambition. Inside, the meeting room was cool and still, the kind of stillness that came before something important. Madeline stood at the head of the table, finishing her presentation to a group of West Coast investors. Her tone was calm, her gestures precise, every word deliberate. When she spoke, people listened not because she demanded it, but because she carried the quiet authority of someone who had already faced storms and survived them. Ethan sat at the far end, watching her, not as her boss anymore, but as someone who respected her more than anyone in that room. And then, like a sudden crack in glass, the door opened. Daniel Reeves. He walked in as if he still belonged to the world he had already lost, tailored suit, smug half-smile, the same air of careless confidence that once fooled everyone. Except her. Madeline didn't flinch. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. Apologies for the interruption, Daniel said, his voice slick with charm. I just thought it was time we cleared the air. Wouldn't want your investors making decisions without the full story. The room went silent. You could almost hear the soft buzz of the air conditioner. Madeline's fingers rested on the edge of the table. She didn't turn toward him immediately. When she did, her expression was unreadable. "You're trespassing, Daniel." He gave a low chuckle. "Big word for such a small mistake. I just came to remind everyone who you really are. Or should I say, who you were." Ethan stood then, slow and deliberate. He didn't speak yet, just stepped closer. The quiet gravity of his presence enough to draw all eyes to him. Madeline didn't need his protection, but his silent support, she felt it like warmth at her back. "Go on," she said, her voice even. "Say what you came to say." Daniel smirked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You see, gentlemen, Ms. Hart here has a colorful history. Scandals, failed engagements, questionable choices. Not exactly the kind of woman you'd trust to lead a billion-dollar partnership." Madeline let him finish. The room tensed, eyes darting between them. Then she rose slowly from her chair. The sound of it scraping against the polished floor cut through his words like a blade. When she spoke again, her tone was soft, but it carried. "You're right about one thing, Daniel. I made mistakes. I trusted the wrong man, believed in promises built on lies, and I paid for that. Every day for years." She took a step forward. "But here's the difference between us you never learned. You think fear is power. You think control is love. But all you ever had was noise." Daniel blinked, his smirk faltering just slightly. Madeline's voice stayed calm, almost tender. "You don't scare me anymore. You don't define me. You don't even interest me." Then, with a small, steady smile, "You don't have any power here." The silence that followed was thick, heavy. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Ethan finally spoke, his tone low, measured. "You should leave, Daniel, before you embarrass yourself further." Daniel's eyes darted between them, searching for control, for weakness. He found none, not in her, not in the man beside her. He scoffed, trying to laugh it off. "You two really think you've won, don't you?" Ethan didn't answer. He just looked at him steady, quiet, unshaken, and somehow that was worse than any threat could have been. For the first time, Daniel looked small, the kind of small that no expensive suit could hide. He straightened, clearing his throat. "Fine," he muttered, "but this isn't over." Madeline's gaze was steady. "It was over the day I stopped caring." He hesitated a beat longer, then turned and walked out, the echo of his footsteps fading down the corridor. When the door closed, no one spoke for several seconds. The investors shifted uneasily, unsure whether to stay or flee. Madeline turned toward them, her composure untouched. "Where were we?" she asked calmly. "Ah, yes, the projections for the third quarter." It was impossible not to admire her. Even the most skeptical among them leaned forward again, captured not just by her strategy, but by her strength. Ethan stayed quiet, watching her regain control of the room as though nothing had happened. There was no tremor in her hand, no shadow in her eyes, only the certainty of someone who had finally broken free. After the meeting, when the last of the investors had gone, she walked out to the terrace overlooking downtown Los Angeles. The evening light poured across the city, turning the skyline into gold. She stood there for a long time, letting the wind move through her hair. Ethan joined her, stepping up beside her, but not too close. "You handled that?" he said softly. She smiled faintly. "He's just noise now. And you." She looked out at the horizon, finally quiet. He nodded, his gaze following hers. "You know, a year ago, I might have tried to destroy him myself, prove a point. And now, he said, his voice gentler, "I realize some people destroy themselves just fine." She turned to him then, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she said simply. He shook his head. "You didn't need me." "Maybe not," she said, "but I wanted you here. That admission hung between them, not heavy, but honest. The kind of truth that didn't demand more explanation. For a while, they stood in silence, watching the sun sink lower. The city shimmered beneath them, alive and endless. Finally, Ethan said, "You're free now." Madeline smiled, a real smile this time, soft but sure. "No, Ethan, I've been free for a while. I just finally noticed." And as the light faded, casting long shadows across the terrace, there was peace. Not the loud kind that comes after victory, but the quiet kind that comes after release. Daniel was gone. The ghosts were gone. What remained was something simple, solid. Two people standing side by side, not bound by need, but by choice. And though neither said it aloud, they both knew it. The story wasn't ending. It was only just beginning again, on their own terms. The night unfolded quietly over Los Angeles, its lights shimmering like fallen stars scattered across the city. From the balcony of the penthouse suite, the air was cool, touched by the faint hum of the ocean miles away. Ethan stood by the glass railing, hands in his pockets, watching the city breathe beneath him. It was late, yet the skyline seemed alive, restless just like the heart in his chest. Inside, Madeline moved softly through the space, her reflection dancing across the floor-to-ceiling windows. She had changed out of her business clothes into something simple, a cream sweater, her hair loose, her face unguarded. For once, she wasn't the strategist, the executive, the woman who carried the weight of composure. She was just Madeline. Ethan turned when he heard her laugh quietly to herself, watching the faint flicker of a candle she'd lit on the table. "You always bring light into rooms, don't you?" he said, his voice low. She smiled, stepping beside him. "Maybe I just got used to chasing it." They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, the city stretching endlessly below. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that held years of unspoken understanding, the kind that didn't need filling. Ethan took a deep breath. "Do you remember the first time we stood like this?" Madeline nodded. "You were checking your phone every 30 seconds. He chuckled. "I didn't know how not to." "You've changed." He turned to her. "You did that." She looked at him, her gaze soft but steady. "No, Ethan, you changed because you wanted to." He smiled faintly, but his heart was pounding. There was a different kind of energy in the air now, quiet but charged, like the pause before a confession. He reached for the small velvet box that had been sitting in his pocket all night, his thumb brushing over the smooth edge of it. He'd carried it with him for weeks, waiting for the right moment. But he realized there would never be a right one, only one that was real. "Madeline," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned to him, and something in her expression told him she already knew. "I've spent most of my life building things," he said. "Towers, hotels, entire cities made of glass and stone. But none of it ever felt like home. Not until you walked in." Her eyes glistened. "Ethan," he shook his head gently, his words careful, honest. "I thought success would fill the silence inside me. It didn't. You did. You didn't fix me. You didn't try to. You just saw me when I didn't even know who that was anymore." The wind moved through her hair, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the garden below. He could see the reflection of her tears before they even fell. He stepped closer, took her hand, and for the first time in a long time, his voice trembled. "I don't want a life that's just about winning anymore. I don't want another deal, another empire, another empty room." He dropped to one knee. The world seemed to still the hum of the city fading, time slowing to a single heartbeat. "I want you, Madeline Hart, all of you. The strength, the fire, the quiet moments no one else sees. I want to build something that doesn't need walls to stand. I want a life with you in it." He opened the box. Inside, under the dim golden light, the sapphire caught the glow deep blue, steady, timeless. It wasn't a diamond. It wasn't meant to be. It was deliberate, honest, the color of truth. Madeline pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her breath catching. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city below blurred behind her tears. Ethan looked up, his voice breaking softly. "Marry me." She laughed through her tears, a sound that was half disbelief, half release. "Ethan!" She knelt down in front of him, her hands framing his face. "You don't even need to ask." But he did. Because this was the one thing he never wanted to take for granted. "Yes," she whispered finally, the words slipping out like a promise, like a prayer. "Yes, I will." He exhaled, a shaky laugh leaving his chest as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. He had measured it quietly weeks ago, when she'd once handed him a pen, her hand brushing his, unaware that he'd memorized the size, the shape, the feel of it. She leaned into him then, their foreheads touching, both laughing softly through tears they didn't bother to hide. The city lights reflected in her eyes like tiny constellations. And for the first time, Ethan felt like the world had stopped chasing him. He wasn't running anymore. He was arriving. For a long moment, they stayed that way, kneeling, holding each other, saying nothing. Then Madeline pulled back just enough to look at him. "You chose a sapphire," she said softly. Why he smiled. Because it's not flawless. It's strong. It holds light and shadow at the same time. Like you. Her breath caught again, and she laughed quietly through it. "You've gotten better at this, Mr. Callahan, only because I finally had the right teacher." She stood, and he rose with her, drawing her into his arms. Behind them, the wind carried the sounds of the city sirens in the distance, music from a rooftop, laughter from the streets below. Life went on, vast and messy and beautiful. But for them, this was enough. The quiet between two heartbeats, the stillness after the storm. She looked up at him, her voice barely audible. "You really mean forever." He smiled, brushing his thumb along her cheek. "I don't know how to mean anything else anymore." They kissed then, not like before, not out of longing or relief, but with the deep, steady certainty of two people who had finally come home. When they pulled apart, she looked at the ring again, its blue glow catching the light. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think love had to hurt to be real." Ethan took her hand, and now, she said, smiling, "I think it just has to be true." He nodded, his voice low, almost lost to the wind. "Then this is as real as it gets." The night stretched out before them, wide and full of promise. The city below kept moving, unaware that, high above, two hearts had finally stopped searching. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Callahan didn't feel powerful. He felt whole. That was more than enough. The morning air in Carmel by the sea carried a quiet kind of joy, soft, briny, touched by the scent of pine and the ocean's whisper. The new Callahan resort stood gracefully against the cliffside, its glass walls reflecting the endless blue of the Pacific. Guests and journalists gathered by the courtyard, where a silk ribbon fluttered in the coastal breeze. Ethan stood beside Madeline, the silver scissors in his hand catching a glint of sunlight. She wore ivory, simple and elegant, her hair gathered loosely, strands dancing in the wind. When she turned to look at him, he smiled, not the sharp, practiced smile of a CEO, but the real one, the kind that reached his eyes. The cameras clicked, the crowd murmured, but for a brief moment, it all faded away. He saw only her, the woman who had walked into his life, and, without asking permission, rearranged everything inside it. "Ready?" she asked softly. He nodded, squeezing her hand. Together, they cut the ribbon. Applause rippled through the courtyard, blending with the distant sound of waves. The new resort, their shared dream, was officially open. 6 months had passed since the night he knelt on that balcony. 6 months since she said yes. They had married quietly, surrounded by a few close friends and family. No press, no headlines, just vows whispered beneath a sky full of stars. Now, standing here, Ethan realized something simple success used to mean applause. Now, it meant peace. Later that afternoon, when the ceremony ended and the guests began to drift inside, he found Madeline out by the cliffs. She stood near the edge, where the land met the sea, her dress brushing the grass, the wind teasing her hair. The horizon stretched endlessly before her, a line of gold and blue melting together. He walked up quietly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. She leaned back against him, her hands resting over his. Neither spoke for a while. They didn't need to. The ocean filled the silence with its steady rhythm, the same rhythm their hearts had somehow learned to follow. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "It is," he said, looking not at the view, but at her. She turned slightly, her eyes catching the sunlight. "Do you ever think about the past?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it doesn't feel heavy anymore. It just feels like something that had to happen, so I could find this." Madeline smiled, a quiet curve of peace on her lips. "You've changed, Ethan," he thought for a moment, then said softly, "No. You just helped me remember who I was before I forgot." A gull passed overhead, its wings cutting gracefully through the wind. Below, the waves rolled against the rocks, unhurried, eternal. For a long while, they stood there in silence, just breathing. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for words, it just is. Inside the resort, laughter echoed from the lobby. Somewhere, music began to play a slow jazz tune, mellow and warm. Ethan turned her gently, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "Do you ever wonder what people will say about us?" Madeline tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He smiled. The CEO and the woman who challenged him. The headlines wrote themselves once. She chuckled softly. "Let them. They never understood the story anyway." "No," he agreed, pulling her closer. "They didn't." She looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "You know, for so long, I thought love was something you had to earn to prove you were worthy of it. But it's not. It's something you give freely, or it's not love at all." He nodded, his thumb tracing slow circles against her hand. "And I thought love was something you controlled, something you could keep safe, like an investment. Turns out, it's the opposite. You only find it when you let go." Her eyes softened. "We both had to lose ourselves a little, didn't we? Maybe that's how you find the right person," he said, "by getting lost just enough." A faint breeze passed between them, carrying the scent of salt and wildflowers. Time seemed to slow, stretching into something tender and infinite. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat beneath. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He smiled. "What? The ocean? It never stops moving. Even when it's calm, it's alive." He looked out toward the endless expanse of water, the sunlight glinting off the surface like scattered diamonds. "Kind of like us," he said quietly. Madeline closed her eyes. "Exactly like us." They stayed there until the sun began to lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The light caught on her ring that deep sapphire glow, and for a moment, Ethan thought about everything that had led them here. The mistakes, the pride, the loneliness, the fear. Every piece of it had built the path to this exact moment. He didn't regret any of it. When the first cool wind of dusk swept through, she turned to him and said softly, "Let's go home." He nodded, taking her hand. Together. They walked back toward the resort, the sound of the sea following them like a blessing. Guests waved as they passed, champagne glasses in hand, music floating through the air. Inside, lights glowed warm and golden. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like he was standing on top of the world. He felt like he was standing within it, present, grounded, whole. As they reached the entrance, Madeline paused and looked back one last time at the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath the fading light, vast and forgiving. She squeezed his hand. "You know what I think," she said quietly. "What's that?" "That the biggest victories aren't the ones people see. They're the ones you feel right here." She touched her chest, just over her heart. He smiled, understanding without needing to speak. They stepped inside, and the doors closed softly behind them. Outside, the waves kept rolling calm, steady, eternal, and somewhere between the sound of the sea and the glow of that last golden hour, it became clear. The greatest triumphs of their lives would never be written in contracts or headlines. But in the quiet moments, the ones when love had no audience, no agenda, no performance, just two hearts that had learned, finally, how to stay. And as the night settled over Carmel, the last light of the sun brushed against the glass of their new world, glinting once more off the sapphire on her hand, the color of faith, of forgiveness, of everything that endures. Ethan took one last look at it, smiled softly, and whispered the only truth that mattered anymore. "We made it home, in the end." Ethan and Madeline's story reminds us that the greatest victories in life aren't found in power, wealth, or success. They're found in the quiet courage to open our hearts again. We spend much of our lives building walls to protect ourselves from pain. Yet it's only when we allow someone to see beyond those walls that healing begins. Love, at its truest, isn't about possession or perfection. It's about presence, patience, and choosing kindness even when it's hard. For those of us who have lived long enough to know that life doesn't always go as planned, this story whispers a gentle truth. It's never too late to begin again. We can all change, no matter how many years pride or fear has kept us closed. Sometimes, the right person, or simply the right moment, can remind us who we really are beneath the noise. And when that happens, when forgiveness replaces bitterness and understanding replaces control, we find something far greater than success. We find peace. Because in the end, the most beautiful thing we ever build is not an empire, but a heart that knows how to love and how to be loved without fear. Thank you, dear listeners, for spending your time with the Shining Stories today. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of something beautiful about life and love, we'd be so grateful if you could give it a like, share it with someone who needs a little light, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing heartfelt stories that warm the soul and remind us all that kindness, hope, and love never grow old. Until next time, take care of your heart and keep shining.